Welcome to the Beau Show. In a past episode of this show, I tackled the inconvenient topic of the drug fentanyl, which is cheap, easily acquired, and deadly in tiny doses. It has made its way into the United States fairly easily and comes largely from synthetic makers in China. But a newly released report shows that drug overdoses accounted for at least 100,000 deaths in 1 year alone. And I feel like we have to address this sad elephant in the room, because we have focused a lot on the COVID pandemic and how many folks lost their lives to it. But lost in this conversation was the reality of the side effects of the pandemic. Things like anxiety and depression, mental health, and a general societal malaise. In turn, this was a perfect storm for those who were drug users to abuse even more, and perhaps for new users to begin experimenting, feeling driven to escape, so to speak. Overdose deaths have been steadily climbing for 2 decades, but the past 2 years have been even more stark, with a 30% jump in 2020. President Joe Biden called it a tragic milestone and has tried to direct Congress to devote billions of dollars to this problem. But once again, Biden always has a naive, misguided approach. He thinks you can spend your way out of a problem or borrow your way out of a debt. If he really cared about it, he'd be talking a lot more about it, rather than pushing vaccines or punishing the unvaccinated or throwing more money at problems. I remember President Trump being very vocal about the opioid epidemic, making it a critical focus of his campaign in 2016. And one way that he chose to tackle the issue was reducing the influx of drugs like fentanyl from China. This actually worked to some degree, as opioid deaths dipped in 2018. What Biden wants to do is focus on treatment, whereas Trump was focused on the prevention and the source of the problem. To me, it's pretty easy to see that there is too much vested financial interest in treatment, basically weaning a person off of heroin to a lesser evil such as methadone. And that's not to say that methadone is bad or not a good treatment. It's just to say that we are reacting to the problem rather than preventing or mitigating the problem. Experts, and again, this is such an anonymous, perfunctory term, blame the surge in deaths on fentanyl hitting the drug supply and the pandemic's isolating effects, with users not being able to get treatment. But once again, that focuses on treatment, not on prevention or root cause. If you look at this map, you will see hotspots of drug overdoses by state. Vermont, California, Tennessee, Oregon, and West Virginia saw deaths increase by around 50% or more in the last year. Drug overdoses now surpass deaths from car crashes, guns, and even flu and pneumonia. The total is close to that for diabetes, the nation's number 7 cause of death. Think about that. You have a better chance of dying from drug overdose than a car crash, a gun, or the flu. The CDC estimates conservatively that between May 2020 and April 2021, 100,300 people in the United States died of drug overdoses. 2021 will likely see an even higher number than 100,000. 5 years ago, fentanyl surpassed heroin as the leading cause of overdoses. Fentanyl is getting mixed into cocaine and methamphetamine, which is amplifying the matter. Furthermore, fentanyl is cheap and lethal. So drug dealers are many times cutting down their heroin or cocaine by mixing in the fentanyl. They're depurifying it and putting in this as filler. And it's knocking people out stone cold. According to the Associated Press, drug cartels in Mexico are using chemicals acquired from China to mass produce and distribute fentanyl and meth across America, much to their financial gain. So let's think about the perpetrators of this. China, who makes the product or the ingredients to the product. It's shipped to Mexico, where the cartels can easily and cheaply mass produce it. And then it comes across our borders through any number of ways, not the least of which could be human mules and traffickers, exploiting our immigration policies that Joe Biden and company have failed to address. You would almost presume that our drug problem might actually decrease during a pandemic because of lockdowns, limited travel, limited supply, and tight port entries. But no, the problem actually got worse. Take a look at this exchange between Senator John Kennedy and Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas.
Your department has released thousands of people illegally into this country who are drug dealers, haven't you?
I'm not familiar with what you've just articulated. It is our policy that if an individual is a drug dealer and we encounter and apprehend that individual at the border, and the individual poses a public safety threat, and there are not conditions that are available to us to ensure the safety of the American
But how do you know if 1,000 a day, according to the Washington Post, are coming in undetected?
If I may, just to finish my statement,
I'm sorry.
If there are not conditions that can secure the safety of the American people, that individual is detained, is placed in immigration custody.
Right. We know the superlative job y'all are doing.
While the media was freaking us all out about spreading COVID, there was a furtive drug problem spreading within our own borders. Magnified by anxiety and unrest, the drugs got where they needed to get to, did they not? And the age of the overdosers is getting younger and younger. The problem, of course, is that a person buying illicit drugs, whether that's cocaine or marijuana or heroin, do not know the purity of the drug that they're consuming. No one has vetted that for them, and they trust it. That costs lives. But how did it get here in the first place? Well, the simple answer is China and Mexico. We already know that China was able to spread COVID here all too easily, and this is another backdoor, cheap, easy way to kill Americans. Hiding under this border crisis and the cries for amnesty and open borders are the drugs getting into this country. This year, the DEA has seized 12,000 pounds of fentanyl. Law enforcement measures alone, though, will not put a plug in this pandemic. It's going to take an effort to stop both the supply and the demand. The way I see it, both supply and demand are up and continuing to rise. American leadership aids supply by a porous border policy and not cracking down on Chinese fentanyl. Leadership also aids demand by lockdown measures that perturb mental health and encourage escapism. I'm a realist, and I know that we will never see drug abuse cease in this country. There will always be people who use, abuse, and die. This will not change. People look for the easy out. But whether those drugs get in their hands is our fight. See, in reducing small drug offenses or even dealing, we may be reducing sentencing for those who might be responsible for fentanyl lacing. Mexico's cartels will never end. They're far too powerful, and they're far too aggressive and clever. They're like roaches after a nuclear bomb. They find ways to reemerge. Also, the profit is too lucrative and desirable. As automation will eventually kill off the low-wage worker, people will continue to seek drug dealing as a viable career path. And because there are so many of them, it's tough to stamp them all out. And then there are the pharma companies themselves, or let's call it the legal way of pushing drug habits. Xanax, Adderall, Vicodin, and other prescription drugs that can be easily abused and are highly addictive. They have a responsibility in all of this too. But because illegal fentanyl is so prevalent and easily made and distributed, it's going to be a deadly weapon. And it affects everyone from the richest of the rich to the poorest of the poor. It crosses racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic divisions. They could be first-time users or long-term addicts. Let's take the sad death of 21-year-old Travis Gustafson of Minnesota. He had dabbled with drugs and had received treatment. The morning of his death, he had a tooth pulled, but he was not prescribed hard pain meds due to this past drug history. So he said he would just ride it out with ibuprofen. But Gustafson contacted another 21-year-old who supplied him with heroin containing fentanyl. According to reports, Gustafson was contacting this guy through social media, and he sent a photo of a white substance lined up, asking the supplier if it was the right amount. The guy responded back, "Smaller, bro. Be careful, please." See how sad this is? You have kids with their whole lives ahead of them, medicating themselves and asking people on social media if the dosing is right. Social media has also been a terrible influence when you consider things like the Tide Pod Challenge. Do you remember that? People were challenging you to consume a Tide laundry detergent pod. When memes like this spread, it creates a flirtation with the taboo. And Tide Pods can be highly harmful if they're swallowed. But impressionable kids will do anything. And internet fame has made kids more likely to be brazen to gain their moment of infamy. So whether it's Tide Pods or fentanyl-laced weed or heroin, the demand and the desire are there. And in this push to make marijuana legal, one thing that might be advantageous from getting pot from a medical supplier is the reduction of fentanyl lacing. But if you want cocaine, heroin, meth, MDMA, or any other recreational drug, it's dealer's choice when it comes to what you're actually getting. About 130 people per day die from opioid overdoses. Half of those are due to the misuse of prescription painkillers, such as OxyContin, Vicodin, and morphine. And the other half due to fentanyl-laced drugs. In many cases, these drugs were mixed with alcohol or other drugs. Medical personnel and first responders have been effective at mitigating some deaths with the use of Narcan, which can reverse an opioid overdose. But once again, that's a last-ditch effort. So let's break down where this massive drug pandemic can be tackled. Yes, of course, treatment is key. People need access to treatment to help them. Drugs such as buprenorphine and naltrexone can be effective. But most users don't just require one treatment. They will fall back into the abuse pattern. Therapy needs to come with it. I read an article by Peggy Compton, an associate professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's very much an advocate of MAT, or medication-assisted therapy. But Peggy leaves out the supply and trafficking issue altogether. She's really only focused on the medical side of the issue. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma, created OxyContin and now have immunity from all legal action after paying out $4.3 billion. So while, yes, the courts can, hold the big pharma companies accountable for things like OxyContin, we have to deal with the illegal flow of drugs into the country as well, which can be focused on Mexico and China. The cartels are directly involved in all southern border crossings, whether that's their product or people. Without a proper border policy, we will continue to see an influx of drugs into this country. The demand is too great. This is profit from people's pain. The Brookings Institute lists 4 ways to address the crisis. Number 1, limit prescription opioids, or what you might call pill mills. This is problematic because it introduces opioids to new patients who can abuse them or divert their use for other ailments. One solution then can be prescription drug monitoring programs, where healthcare providers can see if any other provider has prescribed opioids already. Prescriber limits can also be a tool. Education would be key here. Strategy 2, reduce the flow of illicit drugs. You'll need intelligence sharing across state and federal departments for this, as well as robust law enforcement. This one is probably the toughest because, as I previously mentioned, just when you've plugged one hole in the boat, 10 more are created. Strategy 3, promoting treatment. This is where medication-assisted treatment comes in. But patient abstinence to treatment will always be a distinct probability. Just because the treatment is available does not mean a user will sign up. And then the 4th strategy is harm reduction. This is where life-saving drugs like Narcan come in. But again, it's a last-ditch effort. Brookings advocates for making Narcan available to recently released prison inmates, who account for about a 40% increase in deaths. But to me, that's just kind of giving you an antidote, which means you're going to be more likely to use because you have a lifeline. Then they argue for clean needle exchanges, which, again, I think disserves society because it's providing the user with another means to get high. But let's also look at the reasons for drug users to abuse. America is the worst when it comes to opioids per capita. Carol Graham writes about this for Brookings. She calls them deaths of despair, in which blue-collar communities are losing people to opioids due to the reduction in quality and quantity of jobs. This affects largely less than college-educated whites, who are also middle-aged, who see more despair and lack of meaning. She agrees with my earlier point that automation, specifically sectors with Chinese competition, is killing low-skill jobs. Big pharma and drug traffickers are more than ready to supply that demand. Where I think Graham gets it wrong, though, is that her analysis of the supply and demand issue is correct, but she blamed Trump for not addressing the root cause, when Trump was a job creator, a guy who got tough with China and brought back a lot of jobs in a booming economy. Now compare that with the Biden economy. While we sluggishly come back from this pandemic, inflation is skyrocketing. People can't afford basic goods, and they hoop and holler for minimum wage, but automation is setting in and China exploits us once again. The economy is not what it once was. Graham is right to point out that the decline of the middle class and families are at the root of this. But middle classes did better under Trump's economy than Biden's. Let's face it, the pandemic reduced all community interaction. In fact, it pitted communities against one another, especially stoked by racial tensions. Being home alone increases pain, anxiety, depression, and despair. I think we all experienced some form of that in 2020, did we not? People need employment, dignity, a hope for tomorrow. It's hard to do that when gas prices are high and basic goods are more expensive and rents have gotten out of control, while wage growth is minimal at best. In general, the more robust or vibrant a city's economy is, the more hope and optimism there is. Why do you think Elon Musk moved from California to Texas? I think that overall national optimism is poor right now, as evidenced by Joe Biden's poll numbers hitting new lows all the time. Americans don't trust him to get us out of the doldrums. And truly, he is inept when it comes to this. Kamala Harris is incompetent at the border. We need competent leaders for trying times. Indeed, this is a crisis of desperation that intersects social, economic, and public health woes. No one has the magic bullet to fix this, but it's killing so many of our people. Some of it can be traced to pharma companies and practitioners who overprescribe and start a cycle of dependency. But also, the illicit drug market is quite alive, and the introduction of fentanyl has made this problem 100 times worse, as it can kill so easily. The reasons people get high are certainly for euphoria and the dopamine receptors, but also sometimes due to a lack of optimism and hope. So they seek escape, particularly if their job or life is in shambles. I have to say that hope is kind of bleak, because for the remainder of the Biden term, can you see it turning around after all that's happened? For Joe Biden to give this lip service and to just say it's tragic is a gross miscarriage of action and inadequate verbiage. We are always going to have demand for drugs and dealers. But how do we punish those dealers? How do we curb supply? Where are the ports of drug entry? Where are the jobs for the middle class? Biden killed the Keystone XL pipeline, putting a lot of people out of work. Where do they have to go after losing their jobs? Manufacturing is getting pummeled as it competes with China. Where do those workers go? Companies are replacing people with robots, whom they don't have to pay. What are those folks going to be doing now? Community engagement and the arts were decimated in the pandemic. But when concerts did come back, look at what happened at Astroworld. A security officer was randomly stuck in the neck with a needle and became unconscious. Narcan revived him. Several people at that concert also had to be revived with Narcan, indicating that needle spikes or laced pills were rampant at this festival, outside of those stampede deaths that we heard about. Can you imagine that? Going to a concert and getting stuck with a fentanyl-laced needle? Or buying what you think is Oxy or Adderall and it being laced with fentanyl? This is where education has to come into play. I've always been a vehement opponent of recreational drugs for this very reason. You just don't know what you are consuming. Music festivals tend to be drug havens, and even in the more innocuous drugs like pot, fentanyl can be in there. That can be the difference between life and death. I know this is a complex problem, but hitting the real sources is where we should be looking. We can't fix the problem with a Band-Aid. I'm afraid we will never be able to stop the flow of drugs to our country, but we can certainly put a dent in it by being tougher. Finally, I'd like to at least extend support vehicles for those who are addicts who need treatment. SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's helpline, is 1-800-662-HELP. If you need help, get it today. We have holidays coming up, and these are times of great depression for many people. So please be proactive. I'm Beau, and that's the show.